Hey folks, I got a question for you. Are you a parent, particularly a parent of a young boy or a young adult son under the age of 30? If you do have a son, you definitely want to pay attention here. Even if you have a daughter, you definitely want to pay attention because your daughter might get involved with a boy in some time of her life here. And I think it's important for her to have a good partner, a mindful partner. And this is important for you as well because a lot of us as parents, when our kids are not doing well, it impacts our performance. It impacts our well being. In fact, the night before I'm recording this video, my son had a nosebleed in the middle of the night at midnight, and I saw the light on in the washroom. I walked over and just made sure he was okay. I was a little bit concerned, but not too concerned. But I know the impact that it had on me that night. I was like, okay, is he okay? Is he gonna continue to have a nosebleed? What's gonna happen? And he's only 11 years old. Now, when our kids get older and they're more independent and they're able to do things and make decisions on their own, sometimes those decisions aren't exactly the best decisions. I'm coming across many more professionals, executives, CEOs, where their kids don't have the right behavior, or I'm going to say, I don't like to say right, but let's just say mindful behavior, healthy behavior, and it's leading them in the wrong direction. So it could be things like addictions or just making silly decisions or car accidents, whatever it is. And when the children are going through this, when the young boys are actually challenged with things themselves, it impacts our performance. So if your son is out there doing some silly stuff, it's going to impact your performance. It's going to impact your well-being. It's going to impact your life overall. I can't tell you how many people I've worked with that said, they just can't think straight because their kid's off the rocker. Their kids are just doing some silly stuff. And we're not talking about, going out there and perhaps hitting a baseball through someone's window. We're talking about things like addictions or drugs or just, even following individuals and having belief systems that I'm going to be talking about here because there's a concern that I have, particularly with young boys, that they are being led down the wrong path. And this, as a parent, is very obviously upsetting for us. So I want to talk about a trend that I've seen in young boys and young men, particularly under the age of 30. What I'm seeing right now from direct observation and through our research is that young boys right now are extremely challenged. And they're challenged for a number of reasons, which I'm going to get into. But they are also looking for help, and they're looking for help or guidance from the wrong individuals. And that's my bigger concern. I've had numerous conversations with young men where they talk about looking up to individuals like Trump. So they look up to guys like Trump. They look up to guys like Andrew Tate. And I asked them, why do you even think that these individuals are people to look up to? And the number one reason is because they feel like guys like Andrew Tate and Trump have balls. And I give them that. These individuals openly speak about what's on their mind. They're not, thinking about, okay, what are people going to say? How are people view me? Am I going to get censored? They just say it as it is. And I give them a lot of credit for that. I don't like to use specific names, but I think individuals like these two, I think it's important for us as parents to pay attention whether our young boys are actually looking up to these individuals because, put politics aside. So Trump as a politician, I'm going to put that aside. Trump as a leader is an extremely poor leader. He lies. He is very narcissistic. He's considered almost sociopathic. He's got some very challenging cognitive issues. And I think the vast majority of us know that. When he speaks, we know that he's lying. When he speaks, we know that he's making stuff up. Yet we continue to enable society to tune into that kind of stuff. 20 years ago, things like that were not acceptable. I remember my grandfather talking to me about how important it was, as particularly as a man, a young boy, to have strong values, have strong principles, to contribute, to give back to society, to tell the truth. That is one of the most important things that we can do as men, and teach our young boys to do that as well. Our word is our bond. And when our young boys are being led down a path that isn't going to end up well for them, because a lot of these men or boys are ending up with anger issues, or they're ending up with anxiety, depression, all these other things that are impacting men these days, and not in the right way. So what do we do as parents? I'm going to get to that in a little bit, but I want to continue on with this conversation about why this is happening to young boys and young men. because again, it's important for us to know the causes so we can actually address them. Number one, there's an attack on masculinity right now. And young boys are taking a hit because it is not proper. For example, I was talking to one of the teachers at my kid's school, and I said, hey, look, my son and I taught him how to play knuckles. If you haven't played knuckles, it's when you and the other person put your knuckles together. So I'm just going to show it. If you're watching the video, you can see this. And then you end up hitting each other on the top of the knuckles there, and then you got to move your hand, and whoever misses, they lose their turn, and the next person has to go. And it can hurt. It can hurt quite a bit. And when I was talking to his teacher and we were talking about knuckles, I said, yeah, you guys probably don't allow them to play knuckles, do you? And he's like, no, that kind of stuff would not be tolerated whatsoever, which is really, really interesting because we are not allowing boys to express their competition, express their masculinity, express that inner, sometimes even aggression that we have. And it's not necessarily a bad thing to express that. We just have to do it in a mindful way. So these are the things that we're suppressing. We can't even have play fighting, for example. And a lot of parents are concerned when their kids are play fighting these days. These are the kinds of things that are very important for healthy brain development. In fact, play fighting is important for healthy development of the brain because it allows us to test our strength and test it in a mindful way as kids so that we know what it's like and how much force we can use when we get older to protect ourselves, to how much is too much force to when we actually touch someone or punch someone or push someone, how much is too much force that it's actually going to hurt the other person, right? And then what is enough force to actually hurt someone if we need to defend ourselves or in a situation that, hopefully that doesn't ever happen where we have to be excessive in terms of our force with someone else. So these things are being suppressed in boys, and we need to be able to express these you can say inner energies that we have as men. What also is happening is that there's a rejection. We're saying that these boys now who have masculine traits, we should reject them because they're not ideal for society today. And that's not necessary. That's completely false. I'm going to say that's the worst thing that you can do. If your boy has some kind of aggressive tendency, whatever that is, you got to allow him to express it in the right environment, obviously, but we can't put it down. The other thing that's impacting boys is that we have now this disconnected society. Social media is not a way of being connected. In fact, it is one of the worst ways of being connected. When it first started, it was great because you can get in touch with someone that you hadn't seen for 20, 30 years, perhaps from high school, and you could say, hey, you know what? It's great to see you. It's great to see that you're doing well. Let's meet up or let's connect or let's hop on a phone call, and that would be great, or at least just message back and forth. That's not what's happening right now. People are substituting real connection with virtual connection, and it's hurting our young boys. They're not getting connected to society, to people, to communities and groups that they need to. And I have a strong feeling that we're going to see the full impact of this probably within the next 10 years. The other thing that I'm saying is that we're not teaching our kids proper social etiquette. And I'm in this camp as well. So this isn't preaching. I'm not telling you what to do because I feel the same challenges myself with my kids. I have an 11-year-old son and I have a 9-year-old daughter. And it's challenging to raise them because a lot of the other parents aren't particularly paying attention to how their kids are growing up in social etiquette. So what is acceptable for, them isn't acceptable for us, but it's hard to tell our kids that it's not because other people are doing it. So other kids, for example, having phones or talking on or messaging on phones while they're in the presence of other people. That's not necessarily proper social etiquette, or how you speak and speaking with respect, because that's very, very important. When we come back to social media again, the other aspect is the negativity on social media. There's so much negative stuff on social media. It's not healthy for anybody. It's not healthy for kids. It's not healthy for adults. But if kids are exposed to this long enough as they develop their brains, remember their brains are actually, the neurons of their brains are doing two things. They're forming new connections, but they're also pruning connections as well. And pruning means that things that they are not using or skills or whatever it may be, their brain actually prunes them after a certain age because your brain only has so much capacity. And to be more efficient and effective, it needs to prune the things that it's not using. So if your kids are being exposed to negative stuff all the time and they're they're not seeing as much optimism and positivity. Their brain is actually shifting towards that as well. And we call this not the development process, but we call when people hang out with each other that are negative, we naturally have a negativity bias, because negativity bias allows us to be a little bit more fearful of society. It allows us to be a little bit more on edge, which is a way of being more safe and protective so we can live longer, right? So we can avoid danger. And this is what we're seeing in a lot of people today. They're just afraid of everything, and they're just like me right there. My kid just walked in as I was recording this video. She snuck up on me. But that's how our brain works. What a timely event for that to happen. The other part to this is misinformation. There's a lot of misinformation in society these days because people are able to share information without actually fact checking it, without actually having the right resources. And I encourage you, and just like you are listening to this, you're part of my audience. I encourage my audience to do your own research, to do your own fact checking. Don't just take my word for it. Go out there and actually do the research yourself. So misinformation is leading boys in particular to have certain type of beliefs, and those beliefs aren't exactly accurate. The beliefs that Andrew Tate has are not exactly accurate. Are all his beliefs inaccurate? No, absolutely not. Are all Trump's beliefs inaccurate? No. And that is the bigger challenge. When we see someone with, so if someone tells the truth 8 times, let's just say 8 times out of 10, and their lies 2 times out of 10, well, we give that person a pass on the lies. Well, what if individuals are telling the truth 2 times out of 10 and lying 8 times out of 10? Today, in today's era, we are still giving them a pass, and we are still looking up to them, and that's the challenge. And there's a lot of conspiracy theories out there. There's a lot of miscommunication. There's just a lot of anger in general in society. And that's shifting how our boys are behaving and what they think. Now, what do we do to actually shift this? What do we do to change behavior in our kids? What do we do to actually help our children so they can help us? And why do we want to help them to help us? Because if our kids are healthier and better, we will perform better. Our well-being will be better. There's nothing like having a kid at home who is sick or challenged or has behavioral issues or is just not making the right decisions. Again, that's why we are talking about this. This isn't just about your children. It's about you as well. And as us as parents, this comes back to bite us in the butt later on in life, is when we don't pay enough attention to our kids when they're younger and they develop these, I'm going to say, maladaptive behaviors and challenges in their belief system. It requires that much more work for us later on in life. So if we're not paying attention to our kids when they're 10, 11, 12, 13, and they develop these belief systems, well, guess what? When they're 20 or 30 years old, we're going to have to work that much more to help them overcome their challenges. So what do we need to do? Let's just say your kids are under 30. What can you do to help them in particular? This is the most important thing. First is be the best mentor or example that you can. So as a parent, how are you behaving? What are your habits? What are your routines? How are you mindful of your own behavior? How are you interacting with other people? How are you accountable and responsible? What are your top priorities? If you can model things effectively yourself, your kids are more likely to align with that type of behavior. So that is the first thing that you can do, is be a better model, right? And because that's not only going to work out for them, that's going to work out for you as well. So when you have better habits, it's good for them to watch, but it's also good for you. The other thing is expose them to greater sources and greater information. So what that means is expose them to other situations that they're not necessarily used to. One of the challenges as to why people get ingrained in their beliefs is they don't see anything outside of their current beliefs. So if you can expose them to other situations and people and groups, they will see that perhaps their belief systems aren't exactly the best for them, and it can help them shift. Because kids are stubborn sometimes. Kids are really stubborn. Sometimes you can't really get through them. So how do you do it? You do it through examples. You do it through not lecturing, because I've tried that. It doesn't work very well. It's done through exposure to other stimulus, because that's how they're going to learn. Another factor is to actually hold them accountable. You have to hold them accountable to certain standards. This is very, very important. And I'm not talking about military standards. So even though that my grandfather was in the military, he wasn't, saying you have to wake up at this time and you have to do this at this time. he was, I'm not going to say strict. He was very mindful. He was very disciplined, but through his actions, I learned how to be disciplined because he got up every morning at a certain time, very, very early, 4 o'clock in the morning, to do his prayers and meditations and get up and shower and then go for a walk and do his routine. So he was a great example through that. But he also, by doing that, he also held me accountable in an indirect way. It was really, really interesting because I didn't want to disappoint my grandfather. There's no way I want to disappoint him. I'm going to share this story and because it still hurts me to this day. I remember taking a toonie from my grandfather because I knew he had a toonie stash to go play video games at the local corner store. Because at that time, games were 25 cents and there was Street Fighter, there was Mortal Kombat. Those were the good old days. And I took a toonie from him. So for those of you Americans who don't understand, a toonie is a $2 coin. That's what we call it here in Canada. To go out there. Actually, you know what? Was it actually a toonie at that time? It could have actually been just a loonie because I don't know if we had a toonie at that time. It might have actually been a loonie. But my grandfather had a stash, either loonies or toonies, and I took it. And I played video games and I didn't say anything. And I remember my grandfather didn't say anything to me. My grandmother, probably weeks later, said to me, "Your grandfather knows that you took that." Because my grandfather knew exactly how many coins he had. And I felt so embarrassed. I felt so disappointed in myself. I didn't even know what to say. But I can tell you that I never did it after that. That example for me still stays with me today. And I think it's important for us to hold our kids accountable because that will help them develop into healthy young adults when they get older. Another thing we can do is help them find good mentors. It's something that we don't see a lot of these days unless you're in professional sports, but mentorship is something that used to be a thing back in the day. We used to respect our elders. We used to respect people who were older, who had wisdom through life experiences. We don't necessarily have that same level of respect for mentors anymore, particularly in our own family. Extended families are dwindling. And so we are looking at the older generation as a nuisance, sometimes a burden, rather than people of experience, some people that we can look up to and have respect for. And I'm seeing this particularly, again, in our next generation as well, is they are discounting the wisdom from mentorship, particularly older members and particularly older members in the family. So mentors, they're looking up to YouTube stars, right? Social media stars as mentors rather than real life people. The best examples in my life weren't famous or influential people. They were just everyday people like my grandfather, like my uncles. Those are the people that I looked up to, like my grandmother. So these are the people that had the biggest influence on my life. And they weren't these big stars, yet kids these days are looking up to these big stars as people to look up to and respect. And that's not necessarily the case. Another thing that you can do is help them find factual information. Because a lot of the information, again, on social media is incorrect. There's misinformation, tons of misinformation. And sometimes people don't think it's misinformation when they're sharing it because they have a strong belief behind it. But we have to be very careful. And this is why I still have value for academic institutions, for traditional universities and research institutions, because they do the research. There's a certain standard to the research. You have to know your stuff and you have to get your stuff tested. Not only do you have to test it yourself, but sometimes it needs to be peer reviewed as well and challenged. But when someone just posts something on social media, none of that stuff is challenged. There's no science behind it. There's no research behind it. A lot of the times it's just out there because it's something that we've heard and we're just resharing it. So we have to give them different sources of information. So our kids going to the internet isn't always the best information. There's actually a lot of older books these days that we can share with them that have a ton of life wisdom. We got to get them to dig deeper. We got to get them to take this information wherever they're getting it from. Even if they're getting it from Trump or Andrew Tate or whatever it is, to do their research, to test it, to verify it, to see if there's actual validity there. Those are skills that we're not teaching the young generation. They're just looking at certain things and believing it. It's almost like they are far more gullible than than they actually should be. And again, this isn't a put down for the young generation. This isn't. This is actually part of reality. We're seeing this. It's becoming a bigger trend. We're seeing kids become a lot more self-centered these days as well. And we need to give them more responsibility. We got to give them more accountability so they can start thinking about other people and not just themselves. A lot of the reasons why people or kids are having this type of behavior is because they're thinking predominantly about themselves. They're not necessarily thinking about their family units or the other people that are impacted. Because we've taught kids these days that we're more about an individualistic society, right? It's important for you to be you, and you don't have to care about what other people think. And I do agree with that, but we still have to be functional within society. We do have to care about what other people think to a certain degree because we are engaged and involved with other people in relationships, not only in personal relationships, but also within the work community, the professional community. And we have to respect that. We have to learn how to engage that and how to be functional and collaborative and cooperative rather than, I'm going to say, disconnected, right? And being in opposition with individuals. And this is how society is these days. We're more polar than we are actually aligned. A lot of that has to do with politics, but that's okay. So let's bring this all together because I talked about a lot here, but I think it's very, very important because you as a professional and as a human being are impacted by your kids' well-being. And if you can help your kids have better well-being themselves, your well-being is going to be better. And I talked about the number of things that we can do. But most importantly, the number one thing that we can do, if I sum it all up, is be a mindful, present parent. And I'm learning how to be that myself. So if you're feeling that way, you're not the only one. I'm right there with you. We're all on a journey on this together. And the best thing here is being a parent is probably one of the best learning exercises that we can develop because that's going to help us for the rest of our lives.